now. And I just want to say that this series was developed by a conversation with Tim and Ann Duffy. So if you ever have an idea for the library, please just call us. We're very open to great ideas like this one. The second thing I want to say is this: as always, we are working with our wonderful partners, Elm Street Books, and there are books here for to sell. This is a special night. I didn't realize this when we booked Greg Grandin, but actually his book came out right before COVID. So in many ways, this is a book, an author opening. So please feel free to buy a book and get it signed. With that, I'm going to hand it to Susan LaPerla, Director of Public Services.
Thank you, Alice, and welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Grandin, who is here to discuss his book, The End of the Myth, From Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America. It's the winner of the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction. In this book, Greg Grandin explores the meaning of the frontier throughout U.S. history. For a century, he shows, America's constant expansion from manifest destiny to fighting foreign wars to opening overseas markets served as a gate of escape, helping to deflect domestic political and economic conflicts outward. But now the gates have slammed shut, bringing political passions that have long been directed elsewhere back home. In this new reality, Grandin says, it is this new reality, Grandin says, that explains the rise of reactionary populism and racist nationalism and the extreme anger and polarization that our country is faced with today. Dr. Grandin is the Peter V. and C. Van Woodward Professor of History at Yale University and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Society of American Historians. He is the author of 7 books, which also include The Blood of Guatemala, A History of Race and Nation, which received the Latin American Studies Association's Bryce Wood Book Award for the best book published on Latin America in any discipline. And also Fordlandia, The Rise and Fall of Henry Ford's Forgotten Jungle City, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and the National Book Critics Award. And lastly, The Empire of Necessity, Slavery, Freedom, and Deception in the New World, winner of the Bancroft and Beveridge Awards in American History. He has contributed to many publications, including The Nation, The New Republic, The New York Times, and he is a regular guest on Democracy Now!, a listener and viewer-supported independent news outlet. Greg is joined in conversation tonight by Samuel Moyne, Chancellor Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale Law School. Dr. Moyne's areas of interest in legal scholarship include international law, human rights, and the law of war. He is also a scholar of intellectual history, notably 20th century European moral and political history. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed guest to the library tonight.
This one was working. All right, well, so we have maybe a half hour or so for me to ask questions of Greg about what he does in this extraordinary book. And it is extraordinary. Everyone should read it or at least buy it. And then it'll be your turn. So as Susan said, this is a book about the frontier in American history, but I want to start someplace else to give you, Greg, the chance to talk about, why you wrote this and when you wrote it and when it came out. Because in a way, it's a book that's also about the Donald Trump years, which it turns out are not over. And you say at the beginning that there have been two dueling views about where Donald Trump came from. One view is that he came out of nowhere, that America was blindsided by him, and there's no precedent for what he means in American history. And then there's the other view, which is that he's American as apple pie. And you say, no, you want to tell a different story about the frontier that helps explain this moment.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me, and thank you for coming. And thank you for Sam for agreeing to be a discussant. It's really an honor. Yeah, I wrote this. I started writing this book when soon after 2016, with that election, which many of us were shocked by about its meaning. And it is true, as was mentioned, that it in many ways was published right on the eve of COVID, so it didn't have much of a rollout. This is I consider this the book's launch, even though it's five years old. But as Sam said, it's 5 years old, but it's in some ways it's evergreen, because here we are, Back to the Future, on the eve of another election in which Trump is running and making the border and the border wall part of public discourse. There were two kind of, if we think back to people trying to explain Donald Trump and where he came from, in the media, it seemed to me that there were two kind of alternatives. One, that he represented a complete rupture with the liberal tradition of America and its liberal institutions, particularly his willingness to demonize different racial groups, and particularly, especially that day he came down the elevator and announced his presidency and talked about Mexicans as rapists, to focus on the border and the threat of immigration. And so there was one that saw that as a complete break, and another that more critical, a critical take on U.S. politics that saw racism as embedded in the American experience, that for Trump in some ways was really just the fulfillment of the Trail of Tears, the slavery, this is nothing new. And I felt that there was another way of telling the story, and in ways that oftentimes people don't think about how unique and exceptional the U.S. is. And by that I mean, the phrase American exceptionalism gets thrown around a lot, and it means different things to many different people. The U.S. has a providential role to play in world history. We have fairly stable democratic structures. It could mean anything. But one of the things that it means to me is that there's really, and I come out of this mostly as somebody who's worked on Latin America. My first couple of books were about Latin America. Is that what is unique about the United States is its ability to expand, and its history of expansion, territorial expansion, and then once the continent was filled up, the idea of limitlessness. In some ways, this is a book about the frontier. There's a lot of discussion about frontier imagery and the importance of the actual frontier and expansion west and Indian removal and racial violence involved in that, and war was with Mexico and so on. But the real topic is the idea of limitlessness. The idea is that there is no end. So the book isn't really about the frontier. It's about the idea of expansion, of limitlessness. And that in the United States, there developed a tendency among political leaders and intellectuals to organize and imagine politics as the politics of growth, and to imagine and that growth and limitlessness would solve domestic problems. That problems in the present could be deferred through the promise of expansion, and that went on well after the actual frontier closed, through market expansion and through militarism that wasn't just militarism, but militarism with a moral purpose, that the United States was an agent for liberty in the world, and with its history in World War II and so on, and fighting communism. And that is what makes the United States unique. It's hard to imagine another country that has had that experience. There have been other empires, certainly, in the world. But a modern capitalist empire that has had the privilege of unlimited growth. And we could talk about different moments when that growth stopped and the United States had to turn in and confront itself later on in the conversation, but really this idea of expansion. And I think Trump represented a kind of end to that. And what I mean by that is in three ways. One, the financial collapse of 2007 and 2008 really brought about an end to the idea of a kind of unlimited economic expansion. Two, the endless wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, a kind of militarism that had lost its emancipatory justification and was could no longer be understood as a mission. The United States didn't close down any of its military bases. It didn't, Afghanistan it did, but it's still fighting plenty of wars in plenty of places. There's still plenty but those wars are no longer a kind of ideological safety valve. And then three, the real thing is climate change. Climate change, that there really is limits to growth, and this is and it's a real one that's not easily skirted or gotten around. So that's the larger argument, that Trump represents a kind of politics of an awareness of limits. In some ways, he's our first climate change president, or he was. That even though he denied climate change, his race realism, the idea that we had to put up a border, a wall to keep people out, was an acknowledgement that not all boats will float. Not everybody will sit at the table. Not everybody will have a place in the world. That we had to, that resources were scarce and we had to defend our people. There was a certain kind of race realism. Now, I've been going on a while, but let me just say something very quickly. The hook of the book, the kind of justification, was the wall. The way the wall became such an effective organizing symbol for the Trump coalition. He kept on coming back to it. And what I did was I thought about the wall as the opposite of the frontier, where the frontier is a notion of limitlessness. And the historian Frederick Jackson Turner in 1893 wrote an essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, which becomes seminal in future historiography and trying to understand the United States, the importance of the frontier, that what is good and democratic and equal about the United States was forged on the frontier. And the frontier becomes a symbol of America's way of life, that Trump had kind of flipped Frederick Jackson Turner on his head. And he gave the United States a new symbol, a more brutal symbol of American nationalism, and that was the border wall.
Okay, so I want to ask about some moments, selected moments in your retelling of U.S. history, from limitlessness to Trump's wall. And maybe one place to begin is at the beginning. You're trained as a Latin Americanist, and you begin the book talking about why the Spanish imperial venture didn't leave this legacy of a kind of frontier myth that sank so deep into American culture and psyche. So you mentioned that not all empires are like ours.
Yeah.
So talk about that. Why did ours start out with a frontier myth at all?
Well, a lot of it had to do with geography and just the actual experience and history that the Anglo colonization of North America and the confrontation of of indigenous groups as the main obstacle towards expansion, whereas the Spanish Empire in Latin America, not so much the empire, but the independent republics that emerged from the Spanish Empire, they kind of come into being in Latin America already a United Nations, already a League of Nations, already a community of nations. There's exceptions to this, but more or less they all get their independence around the same time in the 1820s, and they have to figure out how to live with each other. They need a new theory of sovereignty. The United States' theory of sovereignty was an old theory of sovereignty, of conquest. If you read James Monroe's Monroe Doctrine, that's the part that's never included in the Monroe Doctrine. The part you read is the part where he basically sings a hymn towards Western expansion. Now, nothing is going to stop us. How we're going to reach the Pacific. The United States' theory of sovereignty was the doctrine of conquest. Latin Americans realized that they had to find a new way to organize international relations because they all came into the world together. They all legitimated each other because they broke with the Holy Roman Catholic Church and the Spanish Empire, and they legitimated each other as republican, independent republics. But according to the old laws of war, what would stop Argentina from saying, we want to get to the Pacific too? Well, why don't we roll over the Andes and into Chile like the United States is doing in North? Obviously, they couldn't. So they had to come up with a kind of more, they accepted the legitimacy of boundaries as they had existed during the Spanish Empire, and so there was a more of a kind of acceptance of staying in place, whereas the United States, once England was cleared off of North America and once Spain was cleared off of North America, all that really stopped the United States was time out of mind indigenous communities, and I don't believe that, but the way it was understood. And maybe northern Mexico, but we'll get that in 1848. And so it was a very different experience. And also there was a political theory behind this. Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe were Republicans, and they were intellectuals, and they were philosophers. And republicanism, Montesquieu, the spirit of the Lord, was considered the kind of North Star in Republican theory. And he said that you can only have republicanism in a small place, in a small nation, because you had to be able to control, if too large of a nation would unleash passions and interests. And so you had to be able to, could only have it in a small republic as a way of controlling interests in order to create a common good, a common good that was transcendent of self-interests. James Madison explicitly flipped that on its head and said, no, the way that you preserve virtue is you extend the sphere, you keep growing, and this way you diffuse interests across a large geography, and you break up the possibility of factions forming, particularly factions arguing against the indebtedness and concentrations of wealth and questions of rent at the time. Thomas Jefferson said the United States had to grow in order to survive, in order to take in all of the different factions. So right at the beginning, the United States had the social experience of expansion, the fact that it was actually expanding from the Puritans forward, but it also had a whole ideological and theoretical apparatus to justify why expansion was needed to maintain Republican virtue in a country such as the United States, founded on property rights.
Okay, we have to speed up in a sense, but we can't afford to. No, I have to speed up too, but we can't afford to miss you know, how grippingly you tell the story of the relation between the frontier, race, and violence, and especially how the experience of white relations to indigenous peoples kind of sets up an enduring frontier myth.
Yeah. So I wasn't arguing against all of those people who said that Trump was basically a culmination of centuries of racial oppression. I mean, that the experience of frontier expansion was bloody and violent, and the suffering was immense. There wasn't one removal; there was removal after removal after removal. In many ways, a kind of notion of whiteness. I don't really like to use that term, but the certain kind of the self-possessed white man of property was kind of forged in reaction formation to wild Indians who were either understood as children who were out of control or relics destined to disappear. And of course, along with that went slavery, right? Slavery was a big driver of Western expansion, particularly in the South. Slavery and land speculation, and so that's but one of the things that Turner's frontier thesis allowed was to mute that violence in stories of American nationalism, to remove it to the margins. Frederick Jackson Turner wasn't Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt thought Western expansion was a continuation of the Saxon conquest. You know, he thought that the destruction of the Creeks in 1814, Andrew Jackson's destruction of the Creeks, was just one more battle in the long history of coming out of the Saxons coming out of the German woods and bringing forward liberty, individual liberty. That's none of that in Frederick Jackson Turner. It's much more muted, much more pacific, and the violence is kind of ideologized to the margins of the country, and in some ways it actually was. It wasn't just metaphorically kind of pushed to the margins. The border with Mexico becomes a site of violence, of racial terror for a long time, but that notion that a forward motion would leave the violence that was inherent in state formation in the past. And Jackson Turner talked about the United States becoming a world leader, and basically how the organization of Western states would be a model for the United Nations. He was an internationalist. And so that this is really gets at the heart of a certain kind of liberal internationalism, that forward growth outward and ceaseless motion was the heart of American liberalism. And it's a way of, and yes, and it allowed liberals to say, yes, there was violence. Yes, the Trail of Tears were horrible, but we're moving forward. We're leaving that behind. And I think what Trump represented, once we hit that kind of wall of, war, economic collapse, and climate change, was that marginalization of violence could no longer be maintained, and it came into the center of the political discourse.
So I have another question about the frontier before we get to this all-important matter of the kind of move to the border, move from limitlessness to foreclosure and enclosure. And so I don't want them to think that some people didn't do creative and indeed progressive things with the idea of the frontier. So I wonder if you could talk about how the idea allows you to see new things about the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt or about the civil rights activism of Martin Luther King, because I just didn't anticipate you going there and seeing some of the kind of central impulses those two men had as bound up with the myth of the frontier.
Yeah. I mean, in the book, I talk about a number of moments when when you hit a limit, right? There's two choices. One is the race realism of Trump and the nativism, and we got to batten down and keep the barbarians out. And one is you kind of realize you could move to a more expanded humanism and realize that that we have to reorganize our resources better in a more humane way and bring everybody on the lifeboat. And there's different moments in U.S. history where this happens. Like I know this is I'm giving in my remarks, it sounds like it's one sweeping, whirlwind with Elon Musk into the galaxy. But there were moments where the United States was drawn back, and one was Reconstruction after the Civil War, and another was New Deal, and another was in the Civil Rights Movement, and the New Deal understood. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took classes with Turner at Harvard, although I think he spent that semester sailing around the Caribbean, from what I could tell. But he supposedly took a class with Turner. And New Deal is used Frederick Jackson Turner's theories to explain what went wrong. That yes, the United States had this motor of expansion that created enormous wealth, but now that period is over and we have to regulate. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt could give like a 5-minute précis of Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, and just with the wave of his hand say, "But those days are gone." And now he put forward a new ethic of social solidarity. So the frontier thesis, so the New Deal in many ways was very much formed as drew on the theory of the frontier thesis and understood it as kind of, what comes next. We're creating a new ethic of social solidarity where we need regulation, where we can't just skip off into the future. The same thing, Martin Luther King was very much influenced. He talked about the frontier a lot. He thought that the frontier created a toxic culture, a pathology of masculinity and violence, and his understanding of pacifism and self-control, he explicitly said was an alternative to that. Way of thinking about creating a new ethic. And he and of course he came out against the Vietnam War and whatnot. So there's been different moments in which the United States drew back. The 1970s was another moment, a little bit more schizophrenic, right? We didn't get the New Deal, we got Reaganism. Right, Reagan. We got, which kind of reconstituted the frontier, privatized the New Deal, and then and sent the United States back out onto the frontier, and in a renewed Cold War. So yeah, there were different moments in which, if you look at the book, there's different, there has been alternatives that have been broached for thinking about, what happens when you hit a limit, and how to define citizenship when you no longer have access to the promise of limitlessness.
Yeah, the 1960s and 70s, when I read the book, I reflected that that's a period in which, if things had gone differently, we might not have the results we have today. Because, as you say, in that era, you have the Vietnam War, and you really, I think, illustrate really, insightfully how that is viewed as another moment of kind of violence against enemies at the frontier of freedom. At the same time, I don't think you mentioned this, but this is the era of Star Trek, and the era that we have a prime directive where we don't interfere with others. And in fact, we can use our exploration of the frontier as a way of kind of learning
Yeah.
from others, and that's all gone seemingly.
Yeah, a lot of different currents come out of the 60s and 70s with Vietnam. A lot of, Garrett Harding's essays, he has this, he's kind of like one of the theorists of race realism, the idea that if you're in a lifeboat can't save everybody, so you basically have to use the oars to kill the people in the water so they don't try to climb on and pull everybody down. The tragedy of the commons, Population Bomb, Ehrlich's book. You have, so you have a lot, you have some eco-fascism, I don't want to insult any Edward Albee fans here, but he wasn't particularly good when it came to when it came to Mexico and immigration. There was this notion that to save the scarce resources we had to adopt more brutal policies. But then there was more utopian strands that went in different directions. The Vietnam War. I mean, one of the tensions in the book is that wars. It's a hard thing to get your mind around. I know there's the Turing test about when we know AI has come into consciousness, which I think is wrong. I think the Turing test. I think we know AI will come into consciousness when it can hold two opposing ideas in the head at the same time. And in the case of wars both disaggregate the United States and lead to an increase of radicalism and racism and nationalism and trauma, but at the same time they hold the United States together. And for the longest time, veterans coming back from wars, whether it be on the frontier, whether it be in Nicaragua, whether it be from the Philippines, whether it be World War I or World War II, they were coming back to a country that was building its infrastructure, building its sense of social citizenry, right? The GI Bill after World War II. Vietnam is kind of a turning point, right, where that begins to change, and the disaggregation caused by war can no longer be channeled or rolled over into future wars. I mean, a little bit it does. I mean, this is the years in which LBJ is expanding the Great Society, when Nixon passes the EPA. But certainly by the time you get to George H.W. Bush and the first Gulf War, veterans are coming back to a country that's literally taking itself apart. I mean, they're taking apart the factories and they're shipping them to Mexico. And so wars are no longer engines of aggregation, even as they're creating disaggregation. They're pure, and you can no longer, roll over the trauma and the racism that's generated by the war into the next war. That privilege comes to an end, certainly in the world that we live in now. So yeah, the 60s and 70s were an interesting moment in which there were a lot of different ways in which to think about, what to do in a world of limits. And ultimately what we got was Reaganism,
Right.
Shorthand.
Right. So I better ask one more and then let them, but I will have others if they don't have enough of their own. So as a last question then, at least for the moment, I can't get away without, getting you to talk about the border, because Trump didn't discover the idea of closing the border, although, symbolically his attachment to the wall is such a perfect illustration of your thesis. So talk to us a little bit about the closure of the border, especially the politics of the border with Mexico across time, because it didn't come out of nowhere with Trump, even if he symbolizes that move, for us.
Yeah. I mean, Trump turned border politics into spectacle. The militarization of the border was a bipartisan policy, and there's a long history of it, but there's a couple of key moments. I mean, we could go way back to before World War I, when the border was completely open and migrant workers just came seasonally and went back to Mexico. And, the border, you could think of the border as a progressive narrowing and sharpening of a line for the land political culture and political economy and markets that it involves. It's more like labor relations going back and forth. And that changes with World War I a little bit. You know, they start requiring a little bit more vigilance. You know, things like the Ku Klux Klan and a concern, and you know, and vices and drugs coming from Mexico, and you know, leads to a kind of hardening of the border. The Mexican Revolution spills out over the border and leads to quite a deal. If there's a Refusing to Forget History Memory Project that's online, refusing to forget.org or something, and it documents the reign of terror against Mexican and Mexican Americans around the time of the Mexican Revolution and World War I, that either people trying to vote or people trying to union or labor organize. I mean, it was really, you know, thousands of people were killed, and the Texas Rangers and local police and the Klan. But that's that history. What the modern history of the border really starts in with NAFTA in 1992. In 1991, more or less, migration took place through urban crossings, El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, seasonal back and forth. In 1992 and 1993, when the United States passed NAFTA, the corollary to NAFTA was the militarization of the border. The theorists of NAFTA knew that NAFTA didn't include a labor provision. It didn't include a guest worker program. It didn't include anything that, you know, let capital run, you know, fly free and commodities fly free, but labor was to stay put. And it was Clinton who passed Operation Gatekeeper, which shut down relatively safe urban passages through El Paso is a famous example, with the intention of forcing migrants into the desert. Clinton's Immigration and Naturalization Service director said geography can be a deterrent. They thought that the trek through the desert would just be too hard. And that really kicked off these decades of a bipartisan policy between Democrats and Republicans, very little difference, of progressive militarization and hardening of the border. But they did it quietly. They didn't make a big deal about it. It wasn't a point of politics. You know, a little bit. You know, under Clinton, both the Republicans and certain Democrats talked about the illegal alien. That phrase entered the political discourse in the 1990s during all of that politics, you know, Bob Dole and Bill Clinton and Gingrich. But for the most part, it wasn't, you know, it was, and then Bush and Obama both fell into the same trap. They both promised that they would harden the border and seal the border in exchange for some kind of legalization of the tens of millions of undocumented people who live here. They live here because of Clinton's hardening of the border, it's too costly to go back and forth. Where in the past they could go back and come back and go back and come back. I worked in restaurants in the 1980s, and you know, and the people I worked with, well, I'm going to Puebla tomorrow. I'll see you next week. You know, they just went back and forth. You know, that ended with you know, that ended in the 90s and the 2000s. But there emerged a nativist wing within the Republican Party that shut down any deal. So Bush tried it, and you might not remember this, but the precursor to the Tea Party that emerged in opposition to Barack Obama's presidency actually has its roots in the 2006 anti-immigration protests, when Bush started talking about some kind of legalization. Then Obama did the same thing. He promised to seal the border, militarize the border, and with the idea of then they'll deal with reform and legalization later on, and that failed as well. The problem is it's impossible. It's a 2,000-mile border on some of the wildest terrain in the world that separates one of the richest country in world history from one of the poorest countries in the world, there's no way you're going to stop people from coming across that. It's impossible to seal. So rhetorically making that deal that we security first and then reform is a setup for failure, because there is no sealing of the border. There is no amount of technology and hardware that could be applied to the border that could seal the border. And yet it constantly creates the expectation. It's negotiating against yourself. And here we are today with, Trump. So what Trump's bursting onto the political scene and making the border the signature issue of his campaign, what all he was doing was turning it into spectacle, turning what had been a kind of side policy of both Democrats and Republicans into the main attraction. And he's changed the discourse, because in a lot of ways the Democrats now are buying into the idea. I mean, they had been buying into the idea, but now they're publicly buying into the idea that we're tougher on the border than the Republicans. Look, we want to do this and we want to do that, but the Republicans won't let us. So you see how the whole discourse has flipped on its head.
Amazing. So it's your turn.
Get a microphone coming around.
Yes, so there'll be a microphone for everyone who gets recognized.
Thank you very much for the interesting insights. But what jumped into my mind was that there was another country where you had this great expansion, Russia, where the expansion occurred over many more centuries, and actually it failed. It didn't, by far, didn't succeed as the American expansion. And I thought personally the reason for that, there are two major reasons. One, and correct me if my understanding is incorrect, one was that the American expansion came from bottom up, was motivated, it came from the people interest to grow and develop new territory, whereas the Russian expansion came from top to bottom. So actually it ran out of fuel eventually because it didn't have this motivation. Moreover, another very important factor, which seems to me should be mentioned here, is that the success of the economic expansion, the American, it basically caused this emigration and new talent. So it fed, besides the physical expansion, you had technological and economic expansion, which you didn't have in Russia. So, if you can comment on these things, how they actually, instead of closing the border, you actually open the border and make the country more affluent and growing economically, spiritually, and culturally, rather than in case of Russia, which became arthritic in all these respects.
Yeah, it's true. I'm making pretty big claim when I talk about the United States. A lot of countries, there was a lot of comparative frontier studies, Brazil, Russia, China, that particularly in the 1970s, that looked to take apart Frederick Turner. Other countries have frontiers and certainly the ability to move outward. It's just the centrality, I think, and as you said, the success that it did generate so much wealth, and that it was mass driven by settlers. The settlers coming over the Alleghenies. I mean, that was one of the causes of the American Revolution. The fact that the King George wanted to, cut them off at the crest of the Alleghenies and create some kind of autonomous indigenous zone was one of the grievances of the American Revolution. It was driven, and it was world historical. immigration across the Atlantic from Europe to a world that was fertile and rich, and that that more people didn't lead to impoverishment, but more people led to more prosperity was one of the things that the advocates of American nationalism always pointed out. Technology, the fighting the Comanche, Colt. We're in Connecticut. Colt wasn't Colt or Winchester. Who's in New Haven? I must admit I get a little confused about all of these gun things, but the cult, be able to shoot repeatedly while you're riding a horse is a technology that was developed in the frontier. Barbed wire was another frontier technology. But yeah, that's absolutely true. And to your larger ethical point, I agree completely. I think that the more people that you let in, the better it is. There is a weird psychological dimension to the anti-immigration thing, which we didn't. This book also makes an argument that there is a kind of there's a kind of hostility to people of color because they represent the idea of limits. They represent because people of color did the work, right? They're the ones that created the wealth. And they, by their very nature, invoke an idea of citizenship based on economic rights, which is a violation of the notion of individual rights. So there's a profound kind of, I mean, if you go to throughout the country, it's immigrants that embody the undocumented immigrants that embody the values that the right. I remember I lived in Durham for a little while. I taught at Duke. There were no white people sitting on porches in Durham. It was all the undocumented Mexicans, sitting on porches. The whole porch culture that the South likes to, hold up as like being American. The people who are carrying that forward were immigrants. Yeah, I guess I mean, it could go in any different direction. AI, you could talk about AI, you could talk about the cult around people like Musk and flying off to Mars. That's all creating new technologies too. Certainly the technology that comes out of war making. Yeah, but if there was a way to, I think we need a new ethics of social citizenship that allows us to imagine how technology could be used to make human life more bearable rather than more insufferable.
Thank you. I'm curious where you see things going from here with the closing of the frontier in terms of what it means to be an American.
Well, when I wrote the book, I kind of ended on a kind of formalistic, symmetrical. I had this notion, well, the vital center that was maintained through expansion had evaporated, and that left, reactionary nationalism on the one hand and Bernie Sanders on the other. And I ended on a kind of hopeful note that, that there will be a kind of turn to social citizenship and social rights. In retrospect, that was a highly optimistic ending. that the pathologies that are generated by limits are deep and ingrained, and there are no easy solutions, and I certainly don't have them. I mean, Sam and I were talking about, one of the things that a result of a kind of is the loss of an idea of a future. There is no vision. Like, what comes after Ukraine and Gaza? I mean, you could talk about the settlement of World War II and the end of the Cold War. They both had their problems, but they had visions of like a better world. And now all we have, what are they telling us is going to come after these conflicts? Just a kind of revolving series of balance of power, antagonisms driven by economic competition. I mean, going back to the question of Spanish Americans told us that that always leads to war, you know, and there's no vision of the future. I mean, this to me seems, and all of the stuff that's going on campuses, no matter where people stand on the issue, I think there's a deep cynicism, a dangerous cynicism. I mean, maybe it's driving some young people into activism, which obviously it is, but there's even I mean, the willingness to rip down any moral suasion and ideological justification and reveal that everything is just like we're going to send the police in and pull you out of campus, you know, is you know, it's I think we're in a dangerous moment.
Sort of piggybacking on that, the notion of myth, I'm intrigued by that, particularly as you mentioned the 70s, which another writer on myth, of course.
Joseph Campbell.
Right. And what did Campbell reveal in studying the myth systems and religions of present and past? That while myth systems decay, fall away, hold on for dear life, die, that it would be so easy to think, well, the death of one myth must, by nature, then give birth to a new myth. But what Campbell says is there is an inner myth to all of those myths, or a meta myth. So while we may be wondering, well, what follows on the heels of the ending of this myth, is it perhaps possible that intrinsic to this myth and others is a deeper myth?
Yeah.
So rather than a next myth per se, does the destruction of this one reveal a sort of overarching myth, or in fact an inner myth that's native to this one and others?
Yeah. I mean, I got the title myth, you know, I took it from an Anne Carson, Canadian poet and author, to live past the end of your myth is a perilous thing. Seemed to sum up the book very clearly. I mean, I know, you know, as an historian, when I use the word myth, I really mean ideology, or worldview, and yes, it is true that when worldview, myths aren't just myths, and ideologies aren't just ideologies. They actually have to explain in a coherent way people's the circumstances of people's lives for them to have power and value. They have to explain something. They can't just be a myth. They have to have purchase, and that's, I think, the work of ideology. And you know, we've seen this at different times. So Reaganism gave us a new myth, or a refurbished myth, but it resonated. The United States did have a lot of power, and there was an ability to reestablish U.S. supremacy at the end of the, you know, and overcome those limits up to a point. You know, you know, it did speak to people's lives. It wasn't just, you know, rhetoric, and that's the problem. And to leave the terrain of Joseph Campbell and mythologies and go into the terrain of political theory. You know, political theorists or scientists like to think of U.S. presidential politics as a series of coalitions. And you know, and you know, there's the Jacksonian coalition, there's the coalition of 1898 and the progressives, there's the New Deal coalition, there's the Reagan coalition, and it doesn't necessarily matter what part. Like Eisenhower was Republican, but he maintained the New Deal coalition. Clinton was a Democrat, but he maintained the Reagan coalition, right? Like, and not just the coalition, the ideas and the worldview. You know, in order for a political coalition to have power, it has to reconcile contradictions into a worldview. And Reaganism did that very well. I think what political scientists don't, and political scientists like this model, like they have, you know, they have these different coalitions, and then they talk about realignment. What is exceptional about the United States is that instead of having breakdowns in its political order, it has political realignments in which political parties shift years, and the Democrats become less racist, and they become in favor of labor, and the Republicans give up labor, and they become the party of whatever. And so all of this stuff happens within the two-party system. These political realignments happen within at key moments when myths break down. And the argument that I'm making here is that key for that to function was the ability to invoke limitlessness. That I hate to say it, but pretty much every advance in American liberalism, suffrage, white male suffrage, women's suffrage, union movements, the end of slavery, was a devil's bargain that entailed some form of expansion. Andrew Jackson got suffrage for unpropertied white men with Indian removal. The Civil War was fought with the promise of pacifying the West. Even the New Deal, to a good extent, the success of the New Deal was predicated on Roosevelt promising to open markets to a new class of corporations. You had LBJ in Vietnam. We got the Great Society. Woodrow Wilson, through his support for women's suffrage, when conservative women's organizations promised to support World War I. So there's a way in which these coalitions and the idea of progress kind of is deeply intertwined with expansion and the idea of limitlessness. What do we do when we don't have that recourse anymore? When politicians can't point beyond the frontier and say, that's where our problems will be solved. When a politician can't, use the promise of bringing democracy to the Middle East as a way of organizing a domestic coalition. We're in a new world. I think we're in a new period. And I think that's part of one of the things that's scary about the moment.
On that disquieting note, I think we have to stop. I'm sure Greg will greet you and sign your books and answer more questions. But for now, this is just one of his amazing series of books, and I hope everyone reads it. It's a treasure. Thanks so much for conversing.
Thank you. It was nice. It was nice to come back to some of these ideas. Gotta take off, yeah. Oh, yeah. How's the market? They said that.